Now we're all waiting for the final deadline of the August 19th deadline for the US 50% tariffs on Canadian goods. And this is the time where Prime Minister Mark Carney is seeking Trump and essentially in a scheduled call before this 50% tariff deadline, because Prime Minister Mark Carney says he will speak to the US President Donald Trump before the tariffs take effect tomorrow on Wednesday, August 19th, because Ottawa is preparing both for an agreement and for a retaliation if Washington does impose its 50% tariffs on billions of dollars in Canadian goods. Essentially, this is significant because perhaps a phone call between the two world leaders could maybe delay or extend the deadline, or perhaps even solve the big contentious issue with the United States having on Canada and this tariffs. Now, Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Chief Negotiator Janice Charest met with U.S. officials on Monday, and the U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, they also joined the discussions. Essentially, Washington could lower its tariffs on Canadian automobiles, as well as steel, aluminum, and forest products. Now, the US is seeking Canadian concessions when it comes to alcohol, and that is essentially covered by the province, dairy, as well as government procurement. Now, when it comes to auto and forestry, it remains the main sticking point between the United States and Canada. And the top negotiator, Charest, essentially has warned that Canada could suspend negotiations and retaliate if tariffs do take effect. So, well, we know that CUSMA is a whole nother topic, which was not renewed on July 1st, essentially not extending it for 16 years, and now it's up for an annual review. So what this means is that now with this other 50% tariff that does not cover anything that was previously covered under CUSMA, well, this is what the top negotiator is saying, you know what, if the 50% tariffs do take effect tomorrow, then there will be a suspension of the negotiations that also contribute to the wider CUSMA negotiations. And then there might be a dollar for dollar tariff that Canada would place on the United States. Now, Canada and the United States have a highly integrated manufacturing and resource industry. We know that when it comes to the automotive industry, a part can cross the border several times before you have a vehicle made. So this is also part of the issue that Prime Minister Mark Carney must face, right? There's two risks. One is accepting a deal that is perceived as one-sided, perhaps to the advantage of the United States, or what could be in terms of entering an escalating trade war with the United States. So this is a time where Prime Minister Mark Carney is essentially facing his defining trade decision. I think this is the reason why he was elected as prime minister to begin with. If you recall last year when President Trump, well, at the end of 2024, when President Trump won his second term, and then he said immediately that Canada would go, there would be tariffs on Canada. And when he had his inauguration early 2025, then he announced his 25% tariffs, and that essentially led the way for Prime Minister Mark Carney, who was a private citizen, to enter into politics, essentially winning the Liberal leadership, becoming the prime minister after Justin Trudeau stepped down, and then winning a general election against Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. So there you have it. So now he was essentially elected for this defining moment. So now here he is, where he has to essentially make this tough decision of what to do. Does he accept the concessions by the Americans, which may not be a good deal for Canada, or and then prevent this 50% tariffs from being added, or does he go into a tariff war with the United States and dollar for dollar for tariffs? But at the same time, the issue is that the Canadian economy highly relies on the American economy, as 70 to 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. And so therefore, when your biggest customer is pushing back, what do? Do you accept their terms, which essentially also means it'll cost jobs and it will affect the Canadian economy? Or do you go into a trade war, which again will cost jobs and affect the Canadian economy? So here you have the former Paul Martin Communications Director, Scott Reed, who's now essentially arguing, and he does commentary on CTV. He's essentially arguing that Carney, Prime Minister Mark Carney, must use his own judgment to decide whether a compromise with Trump serves Canadian interests, or even if the choice is maybe an unpopular one when it comes to Canadians who essentially want maybe to see Ottawa to fight back. So here you have essentially everybody weighing in on this tough decision that is on the Prime Minister's shoulders, because he must decide whether to accept continuing tariffs or make concessions. And concessions are essentially agreeing to what the Trump administration wants from Canada. And rejecting an agreement could expose Canadian industries to 50% tariffs. So that's much wider and much greater. And it's an immediate setback, because essentially imagine you have your business set up, right? You know your price of goods and you know your price of exports, and all of a sudden there's a 50% tariff placed on your industry. That means everything that you have costs 50% more expensive, which essentially puts you out of the market to the United States. And if that is where majority of your customers are, then you essentially can't really sell to the United States, because it costs the Americans this 50% of tariff to purchase Canadian goods, which essentially protects the American industries and makes Canadian industries not competitive in America. And what is a timeline to be able to replace those customers from the United States to elsewhere, right? We know that there's been policy announcements to making sure that Canadian producers are able to sell to Canadian consumers, and having, the freight costs reduced by 50% coast to coast in Canada, but also, there's that whole timeline of being able to find new customers in Europe or elsewhere. So this is a quite a serious issue when it comes to Canada. And then there's also retaliation. If Canada does a dollar for dollar tariffs, then it could escalate costs for businesses and consumers, because what that means is if Canada then puts a tariff on American goods, then those goods become expensive for Canadian consumers. So Canadian consumers are being outpriced when it comes to selling into America, and now having to pay a higher tax if there's a retaliatory tariffs when it comes to American goods coming into Canada. So this is very significant time in our Canadian politics and in our trade relationship with the United States. The public confidence could deteriorate if voters believe Prime Minister Mark Carney misread the national mood in terms of making concessions or going into a retaliatory tariff situation. So this is very significant, as Prime Minister Mark Carney's party, the Liberal Party, which was really an outgoing party, if you recall, prior to President Trump winning his second term. Pierre Poilievre had double digits in terms of support in the polls for a long time, believing that the Conservatives are going to come back. And if you recall, a lot of Liberal MPs were not going to seek re-election because they saw the writing on the wall. So essentially, you have them change, the Liberals changing leaders from Justin Trudeau to Mark Carney, and essentially making the party more electable for yet another term, because essentially Canadians gave their vote, even though it was a minority government, to Prime Minister Mark Carney, because they believed his economic management and his credentials are part of the reason of making a private citizen to the Prime Minister. Of course, he was the governor of Bank of Canada and Bank of England and many other seats that he held in the private sector. So now you have this tariff negotiations that is the biggest test on whether Mark Carney's expertise and his background in being an economist translates into what would be potentially a politically acceptable agreement and a good deal for Canada. So this is what we're watching, aside from what it means for the Canadian economy that is scheduled for tomorrow. And the biggest part of that is that the Canada-US are also weighing cutting the auto tariffs from 25% to 15%. This is the latest headline that's come out. So this is another significant point, because you have the Canadian-American negotiators who've been negotiating almost every day to this deadline, are discussing a proposal to reduce the US tariffs on Canadian-built vehicles from 25% to 15%. Now, the two sides are remaining divided over how much vehicle content would be exempted from the tariff circulation, the tariff calculation. And so that means that no agreement has been finalized. But when you talk about American content versus Canadian content, it's essentially the part that gets made in Canada, but it's very hard to determine because it crosses the border a few times before the components are put together. So now this proposed tariff, headline tariff, would fall from the 25% to 25% to 15%. Now, this existing 25% tariff was imposed under Section 232 of National Security Authority. And that's a time where Canada wants all North American content, including parts produced in Mexico, deducted before calculating the tariffs. Now, Washington has now said that they want deductions also limited to the United States made content. Now, this calculation method could be economically important as the headline rate from the 25% to 15%. But when it comes to Canadian retaliatory tariffs and disputes over dairy, and this is Canada's supply management when it comes to the dairy industry, the US, and then of course the US alcohol being removed off the shelves here in Ontario, if you recall, they were removed from the LCBO. They also remain a broader negotiations. Now, this is up to the provinces to put it back and make sure that US alcohol products are back on the shelves in all the provinces. But now this is significant because if this negotiation doesn't go ahead, this 50% tariffs are approximately on $20 billion on Canadian goods, and that is in USD. So this proposal is very contentious. The negotiations are still taking place, and we're going to know much more when it comes to tomorrow's deadline of what takes place, or even later on today, because sometimes in the evening news, certain things come out. But of course, we're going to highlight them here. But at the same time, you have the auto industry that's weighing whether they're going to also have a plant shutdown. So you have the Canadian automakers that are calculating how much additional tariff pressure can they actually absorb before they're reducing their productions, and the plants have to essentially shut their doors, right? So this trade issue remains unresolved ahead of the deadline, and these companies are essentially evaluating the production if it can remain financially viable, right, under higher tariffs, because there's not much room for margin. And so when you have the increased tariffs, then essentially it might make it impossible to do business here. So now plants, are essentially deciding if they need to shut their doors, because if they cannot produce, then the manufacturers can't absorb the cost, and therefore these plants are going to stay idle. And that also means a lot of job losses. So now this sector really depends, this auto manufacturing sector really depends on the Canada-US supply chains. And so when you have auto that remains as one of the biggest obstacles for broader trade agreements, whether if Carney makes concessions about it, that also means it's going to affect Canadian jobs here. But if Carney does not make the concessions, then the tariffs come on, then that's going to also be very significant. So the Ontario auto industry is closely connected to the United States assembly parts. And so this tariff will affect the manufacturing, suppliers, dealerships even, and the communities. There's so many Ontario communities that depend on the automotive employments. They're essentially, the auto towns where majority of their residents work in the plants. So these are things that are coming up. And of course, we're going to bring you these details as it's announced by Ottawa and Washington.